New York is a city built on hunger. Hunger for land, hunger for money, hunger for power, hunger for escape. Every generation that lands here thinks it has arrived at the center of the world, and for a while, it usually has. This is a place of harbors and islands, of smoke and stone, of towering ambition and permanent noise. It has been burned, attacked, swallowed by greed, remade by immigrants, and rebuilt so many times that reinvention is not its story. Reinvention is its personality. Using advanced AI techniques, we've transformed centuries-old engravings and faded photographs into vivid, lifelike scenes, so you won't just hear this story. You'll see it unfold. You'll watch the city grow from marshland to port, from colony to capital of capitalism, from panic to power, from ash to skyline. This is the entire history of New York. Let's begin at the beginning. Long before the name New York existed, long before Dutch sails cut into the harbor, and long before Manhattan became a brand recognized on every continent, this land belonged to the Lenape. They lived along the rivers, hunted in the forests, fished the estuaries, and moved through a landscape of islands, streams, salt marshes, and dense woods. Not exactly the image people have in mind when they think of Wall Street, but this place made sense to human beings for thousands of years because it had water, shelter, food, and access. The harbor was deep, the rivers were navigable, the land was rich enough to support life and strategic enough to matter. That geography is the first key to New York's entire story. The city does not become important because someone planned it into greatness. It becomes important because nature hands it one of the best trade locations on the eastern seaboard. The island of Manhattan sits in the middle of a network. To the north is the Hudson River, a highway inland. To the east is the East River, not really a river at all, but a tidal strait, separating Manhattan from what would later become Brooklyn and Queens. To the south is the harbor. Any power that controls this place controls movement. And movement, in the Atlantic world, means wealth. In 1524, the Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano enters the harbor for France and sees a landscape that already has people, canoes, villages, and a complicated human geography older than European maps. In 1609, Henry Hudson, sailing for the Dutch, comes up the river that now bears his name. He is looking for a route to Asia. He does not find one. He does something more important. He reports back on a region that is rich in furs and strategically placed for trade. The Dutch hear opportunity. That is usually enough. By the 1620s, the Dutch begin building a colony they call New Netherland. And in 1626, Peter Minuit reportedly buys Manhattan from the Lenape for goods worth about 60 guilders. That famous sale has been repeated so many times, it sounds almost tidy. A bargain, a miracle of capitalism. But it was not tidy, and it was not fair, and the two sides almost certainly understood the transaction in completely different ways. For the Dutch, land becomes property. For the Lenape, access and use are not the same thing as permanent alienation. That misunderstanding sits at the very foundation of the city. New York begins, as so many powerful places do, in confusion and theft dressed up as paperwork. The little Dutch settlement is called New Amsterdam. It is a trading outpost, not a grand capital. Fort Amsterdam stands at the southern tip of Manhattan. Traders, sailors, laborers, and a handful of officials cluster around it. The town is small, muddy, and practical. It grows because fur is valuable and because the harbor keeps drawing more ships. The population becomes astonishingly mixed for its time. Dutch, German, English, Scandinavian, Jewish, African, Caribbean, and indigenous people all pass through or settle there. From the beginning, New York is not a pure thing. It is a collision. That diversity does not mean equality. Far from it. The Dutch colony is held together by commerce and force, and enslaved Africans are brought in early to do labor the colony needs, but does not want to pay for. Some are kept in bondage for life. Some live under partial systems of slavery that still amount to brutal coercion. New Amsterdam is often remembered as tolerant. It was, in some senses, more open than many European cities. But let's not get sentimental. Open does not mean just, and wealth built on human bondage is still wealth built on human bondage. In 1664, English warships appear in the harbour. The Dutch are outmatched. The colony surrenders almost without a fight, and New Amsterdam becomes New York, named for the Duke of York, brother of King Charles II. That is one of the city's recurring moves in miniature. Somebody else builds something, somebody stronger takes it. The name changes, the language changes, the rulers change, the harbour remains. The city keeps the infrastructure and throws out the flag. The English period turns New York into a colonial town with sharper imperial control, but the city's strategic role only grows. By the early 1700s, it is a vital port in the British Atlantic system. Merchants make fortunes, warehouses rise, docks expand, slave labor remains central to the economy. In 1712 and again in 1741, New York is rocked by slave conspiracies and panic. After the 1741 fire scare, authorities launch a frenzy of trials and executions. At least 30 people are executed, many more are transported, and a city terrified of rebellion reveals exactly how fragile its order really is. When a society depends on forced labor, it lives in fear of the people it has trapped. By the mid-1700s, New York is also caught inside the larger struggle between empire and resistance. The French and Indian War transforms North America, and New York's position near Canada and the Hudson Corridor makes it strategically valuable. Forts, roads, militias, and supply lines matter here. So do politics. This is a city that learns early how to live at the intersection of trade and conflict. And conflict is coming faster now. The 1760s and 1770s are when the city becomes a pressure chamber. British taxes, colonial resentment, protests, boycotts, and street violence all collide. New York is not the most radical of the colonies, but it is one of the most important. Its merchants have a lot to lose. Its docks are busy. Its people are divided. Loyalists and revolutionaries eye one another across taverns, meeting halls, and streets. In 1765, the Stamp Act sparks protest. In 1770, the city sees rising political tension. In 1773 and 1774, news from Boston and Philadelphia keeps pouring in. The atmosphere is electric. New York is about to find out what happens when empire and independence collide in the same harbor. Then comes the revolution itself. In 1776, George Washington defends the city in the New York campaign and loses it to the British. The Battle of Long Island is a disaster for the Continental Army. Manhattan becomes a British stronghold for most of the war. Fires sweep through the city in 1776. Thousands flee. British prisons and prison ships in the harbor become hellholes where American captives die in appalling numbers. The city is occupied, scarred, and stripped of innocence. If you had stood on the streets of New York during those years, you would have seen soldiers, smoke, hunger, and suspicion everywhere. This is not a heroic postcard. It is a city under siege. But New York survives. It always does. When the British evacuate in 1783, Washington enters the city in triumph. For a brief moment, New York becomes the first capital of the United States. Federal institutions settle here. George Washington is inaugurated as president in Federal Hall on Wall Street in 1789. Congress meets in the city. The new republic is still fragile, still arguing about what it wants to be, and New York is right there at the center of the argument. For a while, it looks like the nation may grow around this port city. Then the capital moves to Philadelphia and later to Washington, D.C. But that does not diminish New York. If anything, it frees it. The city does not need to be the seat of government to become the seat of power. In the early 1800s, New York begins expanding northward. The old colonial core is no longer enough. Streets are laid out in the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, a rigid grid that will define Manhattan's development for generations. It is practical, profitable, and a little bit brutal. The grid ignores hills, streams, and the old organic mess of earlier settlement. It says, in effect, that the island will be organized for commerce first and comfort second. New York has always loved efficiency when efficiency makes money. In 1825, the Erie Canal opens. That is one of the greatest economic decisions in American history. It links the Hudson River to the Great Lakes and turns New York City into the main gateway between the Atlantic world and the interior of North America. Grain, timber, people, and goods pour through the port. Buffalo, Albany, and the Midwest all become connected to the city by a watery economic artery. New York explodes in importance. By the mid-1800s, it is already becoming the nation's commercial capital. The city is no longer just a port, it is a funnel. And with growth comes fire, fever, and chaos. The city's population surges. Immigrants arrive in huge numbers, especially from Ireland and Germany. The potato famine pushes Irish families across the Atlantic in desperate conditions. German political unrest and economic hardship send more people. They land in a city where tenements are overcrowded, sanitation is poor, and disease spreads fast. Cholera, yellow fever, tuberculosis, and ordinary urban misery all thrive in dense neighborhoods. The rich build downtown fortunes while the poor breathe smoke and sewage. That is one of the oldest New York stories there is. Opportunity sits next to suffering and calls itself progress. The 1830s and 1840s also bring abolitionist agitation, labor unrest, and political machine politics. Tammany Hall grows into a machine that can feed, shelter, and manipulate immigrant communities while extracting loyalty in return. It is corrupt. It is effective. It is so deeply woven into city life that you cannot tell the history of New York without telling the history of patronage, bribery, and local power brokers. The city is learning how politics actually works in a metropolis, not as grand philosophy, as favors, votes, and the distribution of spoils. Then comes the Civil War era. New York is economically tied to the North, but politically divided and morally compromised by its financial interests. Southern cotton fuels commerce. Banks and insurers profit from slavery even if the city presents itself as modern and free. In 1863, that contradiction explodes in the draft riots. Working-class white men, furious over conscription and racial resentment, attack black residents, destroy property, and lynch people in the streets. The violence lasts for days. The federal government sends troops from the battlefield to restore order. The city descends into mob terror. This is New York at one of its ugliest moments. Not a beacon, a warning. But the war also accelerates national change, and New York keeps growing. Immigration intensifies after 1865. The city becomes the main entry point for millions of newcomers. Ellis Island opens in 1892 and becomes a symbol of arrival, anxiety, and reinvention. For some families, it is the gateway to a new life. For others, it is the first stop in a hard, humiliating process of screening, exclusion, and hope under fluorescent scrutiny. The city draws people in because it promises work. It keeps them because leaving would mean surrendering the chance of something better. The late 1800s are when New York starts becoming the vertical city people recognize today. Bridges rise. The Brooklyn Bridge opens in 1883, a technical marvel and a declaration of confidence. The elevated railways move people above crowded streets. The subway begins in 1904, taking the city underground and making scale possible in a way no one could have imagined a century earlier. Skyscrapers emerge as the city's new obsession. Steel frame construction, elevators, and land values make height profitable. Manhattan does not just expand outward, it climbs. That ascent is not only architectural, it is social. New York becomes a magnet for laborers, artists, financiers, radicals, and opportunists. Tenement neighborhoods overflow, sweatshops multiply. The garment industry depends on long hours and cheap labor, much of it from immigrant women and girls. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire kills 146 workers, most of them young Jewish and Italian women. Doors are locked. People jump from windows. Fire escapes fail. The horror becomes a turning point in labor reform, building safety, and public outrage. If you want to know what industrial capitalism looked like at street level, there it is. Smoke, screams, bodies in the street, and then laws, because the dead force the living to pay attention. At the same time, New York is becoming a global capital of finance and culture. Wall Street matures into the nerve center of American capitalism. Newspapers, publishing houses, theaters, music halls, and universities give the city a cultural force far bigger than its geography. In the 1920s, Harlem becomes one of the most important centers of black cultural life anywhere in the world. The Harlem Renaissance brings writers, musicians, activists, and intellectuals into a flowering of creativity and political thought. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, and countless others shape a city that is both radiant and brutally segregated. The brilliance is real. So is the racism. Then the city enters the age of towers and collapse. The 1930s bring the Great Depression, and New York feels it in construction sites, bank failures, bread lines, and unemployment. But the city also defines the era with monumental building. The Empire State Building rises in 1931, absurdly tall, absurdly ambitious, and finished at a time when the economy can barely breathe. That tells you everything about New York's temperament. Even in crisis, it tries to outbuild despair. The city is saying, very clearly, that it expects the future to be bigger than the present. World War II turns New York into a logistical giant. The harbor sends troops, supplies, and ships across the Atlantic. Industry runs day and night. Immigrant communities contribute to the war effort. After the war, the city enters a new period of confidence and contradiction. The United Nations establishes its headquarters on the East River in 1952, making New York one of the symbolic capitals of the world. This is the city as diplomatic stage, hosting an institution meant to represent global peace, while its own streets wrestle with housing, segregation, and labor conflict. That is New York in a sentence: global and local, idealistic and harsh. The post-war decades bring both prosperity and decay. Suburbanization pulls wealth outward. Highways carve through neighborhoods. Robert Moses, the great urban planner and power broker, remakes the city with sweeping authority and devastating consequences. He builds parks, bridges, roads, and public housing. He also bulldozes communities, reinforces racial inequality, and helps define an era of top-down planning that treats neighborhoods as obstacles. Moses is one of the most consequential figures in New York history. He does immense good, he does immense harm, and the city still bears his fingerprints. By the 1960s and 1970s, New York is in trouble. Manufacturing leaves, tax revenue shrinks, crime rises. Fires, especially in the Bronx, become emblematic of urban decline. Entire blocks are abandoned. The fiscal crisis of 1975 nearly breaks the city. At one point, New York comes close to defaulting on its debts. Newspapers effectively tell the city to die. But the city does not die. It cuts services, restructures, and staggers onward. The subway is filthy. The streets are tense. The arts are alive. Punk, disco, hip-hop, and avant-garde culture all emerge from the pressure cooker. When institutions fail, New Yorkers improvise. That is not a slogan. It is survival. The 1970s are also the decade when the city's cultural identity hardens into legend. Times Square becomes associated with neon, vice, and spectacle. The World Trade Center rises, a pair of towers that symbolize financial power and urban scale. Meanwhile, communities in the Bronx, Harlem, Queens, Brooklyn, and beyond continue building cultures that will define the city for decades. Hip-hop is born in the Bronx in the 1970s, out of block parties, turntables, spoken word, breakdancing, and the need to make something powerful from very little. That is one of New York's great gifts to the world. It turns pressure into art. The 1980s bring Wall Street excess, crack violence, AIDS, gentrification, and a city still struggling to balance glamour with inequality. The real estate market heats up. Finance grows dominant. Michael Bloomberg's world has not yet arrived, but the logic of the city is changing. Wealth becomes more concentrated. Neighborhoods transform faster. Some residents thrive. Others are pushed out. New York never stops moving, but movement is not the same thing as justice. And then the 1990s bring both renewal and a warning. Crime falls dramatically. Tourism surges. The city's image improves. Times Square is cleaned up. The economy modernizes. Tech and finance deepen their grip. New York starts to look, once again, like the center of the planet. But underneath that confidence, there is always fragility. That fragility becomes devastating on September 11, 2001. On that morning, 2 hijacked planes strike the Twin Towers. Nearly 3,000 people die. The skyline changes forever. Smoke blankets Lower Manhattan. Firefighters, police officers, paramedics, office workers, and ordinary New Yorkers are caught in a catastrophe broadcast live across the world. The towers collapse. The city grieves. The attack is not just an act of destruction. It is an attack on the idea of New York itself. Openness, density, trade, ambition, and vulnerability all at once. But if the attack was meant to break the city's spirit, it failed. New York mourns, rebuilds, argues, memorializes, and keeps going. The 21st century has seen more transformation. Lower Manhattan has been rebuilt around the World Trade Center site, the 9/11 Memorial and Museum anchor remembrance. The city's economy remains enormous, driven by finance, media, technology, tourism, real estate, healthcare, and higher education. New York remains a global magnet for talent and money, but it is also a city of huge inequality. The housing market is punishing, rents are brutal, homelessness is visible. Service workers, delivery workers, nurses, teachers, artists, and immigrants keep the city functioning, while many of them struggle to stay in it. That has always been true in one form or another. New York sells dreams. It also charges interest. Today, New York is home to more than 8 million people across 5 boroughs: Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island. It is one of the most linguistically diverse places on Earth. You can hear hundreds of languages on a single subway ride. It is still the great entry point, still the place where people arrive with too little money and too much hope, still the city where entire worlds fit side by side on the same block. But it is also facing real challenges. Housing is too expensive. Infrastructure needs constant repair. Climate change threatens the coast. Flooding is no longer a distant concern. It is a scheduling problem, a planning problem, a survival problem. New York, once again, has to figure out how to endure the future. And that is the real story. Not just size, not just wealth, not just skyscrapers, or subways, or Wall Street, or Broadway, or the Yankees, or the Statue of Liberty, or any of the symbols tourists take home on mugs and t-shirts. The real story is that New York has been remade by conquest, immigration, labor, fire, finance, rebellion, and grief. It has been stolen, bought, sold, populated, divided, wired, buried, and rebuilt. It is a city of cruelty and genius in equal measure. It has profited from injustice and produced some of the most astonishing cultural energy in human history. It is messy, loud, unequal, magnetic, and impossible to ignore. New York's history is not one of purity. It is one of accumulation. Layer upon layer of people, capital, memory, conflict, and reinvention. The city never stops becoming itself. That is what makes it New York. A place that survives by changing and changes by surviving. A place that can be broken and still somehow becomes taller. If you enjoyed this journey through New York's history, please like this video and subscribe for more entire histories. And if there's another city you want to see brought to life, leave a comment below. And as always, we'll see you in the past.